All right, we're back today. We've got somebody I'm excited to talk with because we're going to be talking about media, society. We're going to be talking about abortion. We're going to be talking about politics in America. We've got Professor Deana Rohlinger. How are you today?
Good, good. Thanks for having me.
We can't see you, but we know that you're there because we can hear your voice. Professor of Sociology, Florida State. How's the weather down there right now?
Very hot. As I don't know if you've seen the meme, but it's pretty funny about how North America is hell. We have fire and brimstone. So the fire is the south where we feel like we're scorching, and up north we've got all the smoke. So it's an interesting summer for all of us in 2023.
And to boot, you've got Ron DeSantis just hovering over your shoulder, ready.
Well, we've got Trump, so we've got both of the front runners for the Republican nomination in the state of Florida, which we see them far more on TV than we do in real life, of course.
Yeah, well, I would hope so. So obviously you're a sociologist, so you study a lot about people and everything. So can you explain to me about this latest book? Just give us the outline of new media and society and kind of what is it about new media that shapes our interactions with, friends, family, and ourselves?
Yeah, so this book was actually inspired by my students. I've been teaching a sociology of media class since I was a grad student, so we'll just leave it at for quite some time. And I found that I had this book that I just loved, but I found that I kept supplementing it with things that I was finding online. So once I realized that the price of the book that I was using was a bit high and that there was this gap, I really wanted to write something that would be accessible for students, have exercises. And then if you're not a student, but interested in the topic and want to learn more about sociology, you could. And that's the impetus for this book is I was able to provide for our students at FSU. It's available to them for free through the library, but a low-cost book about how do we start thinking about some of these issues, and even to offer a primer, because every semester I teach this class, I ask students about things that they know, and I think most folks, at least my age, would be surprised at how little students understand about digital technologies and how they work, and kind of even the rights they give up when they're signing up for apps, or when they quickly skip through that end user licensing agreement so that they can get on to the business that they want to.
Yeah. And how, and obviously this is different than what we had before TV and radio and stuff. How has that, what's the difference there as far as the impact on people?
Well, what I like to think about and what I teach about is that it's good and bad. We like to think of digital technologies as either being one or the other, but it's a mixed bag. There's always some positive and there's always some negative, and it's useful to think about both of those. So, for example, if we're thinking about how it might affect our relationships with families, it can be a very mixed bag. New technologies can be very helpful insofar as, just like telephones made it easy for us to break bad news for our parents, or in some sense provided a safety net. Mobile phones really do that for young people because it's much easier for them to break bad news or reach out for help or get advice when they need it. But it also can be harder for, teens, especially, to connect with their parents. And if their parents are physically present but on their phone doing work or playing a game, it can be very, very hard for them to have, casual conversations and get to know each other better, or see or discuss what's on their minds if they're otherwise engaged with these new technologies.
Is there some aspect of capitalism that plays into that, where it's a for-profit kind of attention grabbing? They need as many people on these platforms, or need as many, clicks and likes and stuff. Does that play into some of the disconnect that we see?
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, and it's not just simply thinking about social media platforms or other kinds of platforms. It's also about capitalism at work. So now we don't have the end of the workday like we used to, because your boss or your coworker can text you or they can email you. So there's a lot of bleed over that benefits capitalists, but not always, and owners, but not always benefits, individuals or their families.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, we do a lot of bad mouthing of capitalism on the show, so I'm glad that you said that. But education is also a huge part of who we are and stuff, and our society. So how does education play into these new media shifts?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting area right now that's blowing up. I mean, I think, initially a lot of scholars and folks that are supporters of technology and even politicians thought that new media was this panacea for education because it would make everything so much more affordable and accessible. But we saw during the pandemic that really what new media is doing is flattening real differences among students that social scientists have been writing about for quite some time. So, students vary quite a bit by their familiarity with tech, how much support they might need, their access to high-speed internet. Even if they have a device, there's all of these issues, learning styles, accessibility for students who need additional support in the classroom that we were glossing over, particularly in the K through 12 space, that the pandemic made very visible. I mean, unfortunately, these conversations have really gotten caught up in these debates over curriculum, and we haven't addressed them and these disparities as much as we need to. We're not talking about that enough. But right now, where we're grappling with, as you probably know, is the new AI. And what does this AI mean for students? And what does this mean for professors? And I can certainly tell you that higher ed is rattled by this, because there's always been this tension with new technologies about how are students using them and how do students think about education and why are they in educational spaces. And this is the AI chat GPT. These platforms have really made that tension clear, and folks are trying to figure out, what do we do now? How do we better position students to use this technology while making it clear that the most powerful thing they have is their creativity, their ability to think. And we want them to continue to do this and not rely too much on AI or other platforms that they think will help move them to their degree, but might not serve them very well in the long run.
Yeah. I mean, and you probably think the genie's already can't be put back in the bottle to a certain extent with this stuff. So, I mean, as far as the chat GPT thing goes, are we just going to have to figure out a new way to make sure that the students are learning?
Well, you probably know, if someone doesn't want to learn, you can't make them. I know it took me a lot longer to accept that reality than I would have liked. So will be some students that just aren't that interested in that process, but there'll be a lot of students that still are. And yeah, the trick will be how to teach them to perhaps get inspiration from these tools, or if they're not understanding something well, how to use these tools to get a better summary, or one that they can follow, or that in a way that makes more sense to them, but helping them realize that at the end of the day, it's not going to be able, first of all, you might always get correct answers, but it's not going to be able to do that creative work that pushes them forward individually, or if they have a social change-minded mission or an entrepreneurial message, it's going to be very difficult to have AI do all of those pieces for them. But right now, we're still kind of in the panic space as educators, where we're trying to figure out, what are we supposed to do, and grappling with the cheating issues, which that's always gets more focus than probably what it should, because at the end of the day, we have to think about these technologies and how are we going to use them? How are we going to help students use them in ways that are meaningful and engaging?
Yeah, I always think it's funny. We live in the modern world, and necessity is the mother of invention. But we have stripped ourselves of really great necessity, and so that makes it so kids can go to school, pay an arm and a leg, have their mom and dad pay an arm and a leg, and then sit through class and not pay attention, and have no drive to come up with a degree or come up with a motivation to, for a career, right?
Yeah, but I think that's always been true.
Really?
I would think about when I was in college, I was certainly more motivated than other folks. Education is, you always are going to get out what you put in. And so effort's going to vary. And so what you get out is going to vary. And so while we can't teach students to learn at that moment, we can at least give them some skills and some tools so that when they do decide they're in the space where, hey, I should have paid attention to that, they'll at least know where to go back to. Right? They'll have some materials or websites or whatever we can provide them to go back to and get up to speed. Right? Things are going to continue to change. And one of the most valuable things that we can teach students right now is to be open-minded, to be knowledge seeking, and not just short answer seeking, but be willing to find the tools that are going to help them get where they want to go, which is hopefully make the world a better place, of course. But
right. That was
have control over that.
That was the promise of technology. It's going to make everything's just utopian, and everything's going to be great. I don't know if that's true. We'll see. But also, look, religion is another thing that has shifted over the years, and you wrote about how its influence and mixed with media. And so how has that changed?
I mean, religion just continues to change with new technology. What I found initially fascinating was godcasting, which is podcasts, but that are religious oriented. But, there's been ways to watch services on TV for many decades. But just now that you can live stream, or there's apps where you can get scripture, or there's these apps where you can do mindfulness and meditation. If now with VR, if there's a service that you want to go to and there's not one that's in the real world nearby, you just throw on your headset and can meet up in the metaverse. There's just no one way to practice, and there's no one place to do it. I mean, but there's also some challenges. I mean, institutions are not quick to change, and this can undermine the traditional structure of most churches, which really are reliant on a face-to-face model, right? You have people that come to your brick and mortar church, and you need congregant donations so that you can maintain the facility and the personnel and fund the activities. And so that can be a really big challenge now that there's all these alternative virtually based ways to connect with your spiritual force, as you will. So
I like how you said brick and mortar. That's great. Make church sound like Bed Bath and Beyond.
Well, sometimes they are in strip malls in the South, so I think
that's true. That's true.
Church in here,
right. And then you have the prosperity gospel now, which is intertwined with current consumerism and capitalism in America. So one intriguing topic you address in the impact of new media on law and police surveillance. So can you discuss about how media technologies affect our perceptions of privacy, surveillance, and the legal system?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting one that I've learned a lot from interacting with students. And what I think surprises me is that for most folks, it's a situational concern. So there are a lot of people that do not think about privacy or surveillance at all when they're going through that end user licensing agreement in 5 seconds so they can get to the app so that their Starbucks order, they can place it easier. And so they're not thinking about app surveillance and how their data is being used and how it's being sold. Some of that's changing a bit. I think the Dobbs decision, so the abortion decision, has changed some of that privacy concern. So now after the Dobbs decision, the White House told folks, hey, women, if you're using a period tracking app, you might not want to do that because of the concern of that data being swept up by law enforcement to identify women that have had an abortion in a state where it's been made illegal. But there's certainly people that have always been very concerned about privacy and surveillance. and technology. And, these are economically disadvantaged communities, communities of color, religious communities. I'm thinking of Muslims and progressive activists. And these are all groups that have been surveilled by law enforcement historically. And consequently, thinking about privacy and surveillance is much more center of mind. And the digital technologies has, to some extent helped groups and individuals turn the tables on law enforcement so that they can document their interactions with law enforcement. I think we're going to see more of that now that we have so many states that have passed these kind of so-called anti-riot legislations that are clearly targeting progressive activists and progressive protests. So I think that we'll see having a recording is going to be very important in the court of law, so that when a protester is charged with a felony, if they have also a competing record, that'll be very useful for them. And we've also seen, shifts in terms of in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement. We've seen a lot more push for law enforcement to wear body cameras, and even a lot more low tech solutions, like just really trying to change the relationship between law enforcement and communities of color in particular, thinking about how can we police better? How can we, some cases, just have communities do policing? And Philadelphia has done some really interesting pilot programs where gang members can essentially use an app and have an intervention before things between a rival gang member escalates. So there's this really mix of ways in which, again, technology can be very intrusive and disruptive for folks that are looking to be politically engaged, for example. But there are ways in which they can also harness it for their own purposes and push back and change law enforcement, if not nationally, sometimes on a community basis.
I find them always, with every technological advancement, them scrambling to seize power and try to make sure that the one side's got more power, then it becomes a scramble for democracy in a lot of ways. In Germany, they just made it clear that they were phone tapping some climate activists, and they're constantly trying to make these people out to be terrorists. So yeah, it's a give and take with technology. Frankly,
well, and they're never going to have as much power, right? They don't have the same access to resources. But activists are creative. That's one of the things that humans have always done with technology, is we can turn it on its head. We employ it for purposes that was not initially intended. And I'm certain, when they thought about the mobile phone, they weren't thinking about activists recording a protest, right? They certainly weren't thinking about an individual picking up the murder of George Floyd in 20. So There's a lot of ways in which we can use this technology, which will challenge and potentially change institutions. But institutions are extraordinarily slow to change, unfortunately.
Yeah. And the question remains, was police brutality always this bad, or are we just now filming it? We don't know. So another question is work. How has work changed with the introduction of this new media technology?
Yeah, it certainly has completely done away with that notion that you graduate college, work for a single corporation your entire career, have a retirement party, and get a gold watch. That's such a quaint idea. We certainly know that there's a huge contingent workforce now. And so companies just hire fewer full-time employees, and they hire more independent contractors, which is great for them. It increases their overhead, which increases the profit, and then, of course, the profit for the folks that are investing in the companies. So we've seen, they call it flex security. There's all these different terms that are used, but how individuals think about work has fundamentally changed. They know that they can sell their labor for piecemeal. And a lot of students that are coming out of college have a real entrepreneurial orientation. I think that's why we keep seeing these programs pop up in universities, is because students are trying to figure out, how do you make it in this digital technology? one of the things, of course, again, here we have AI has thrown a bit of a wrench into things because it's expected to replace so many white collar positions in the coming years. And what I think that we'll see is increasingly individuals looking to sell themselves in ways, so they brand themselves, they become influencers, and they try to strike it big on a social media platform YouTube.
Here I am.
Like, well, you're no Mr. Beast though, right?
No, well, I wish. Then I wouldn't be wearing these ratty clothes. Jeez.
Right, but here's an example of a teenager who turned himself into this huge YouTube success, right? And then has translated into other things. And I think when there's a lot of uncertainty in a market, folks are going to look to that model to see if they can reproduce it, not fully understanding that it's a lot easier said than done, because it does take so many resources and connection to make it in that influencer space. So no one really thinks about the thousands of dollars that can go into that Insta moment that's so perfect, right?
Right.
So it'll be interesting to see how companies and their stakeholders employ tech and AI. I mean, we know that if you have a giant unemployed workforce, that's not great for an economy, and it certainly can lead to additional protests. So it'll be interesting to see what companies do, and how does the government respond, which of course at this point has been pretty notorious for not responding well to new technologies and the challenges they pose.
Yeah. And, I've heard things like the gig economy can be extremely liberating for people, but it's only contingent on the idea that it comes with decent benefits and a living wage, which in America it doesn't. But if you look at somewhere like Denmark, I heard somebody say it's actually a little bit more, liberating or democratizing,
Right. No, that's an excellent point. And part of the things that folks complain about in the US is the fact that it's algorithms that decide what jobs they get. If they have a complaint, they can't complain to anyone. It's also platform based, that there is no boss, right? So on the one hand, that can be nice in terms of choosing your work hours, but when you're encountering problems, if you're trying to figure out how to succeed better, there's this giant technological void where your information goes in and it's not so clear what it comes out. So lots of workers in the US have complained about the algorithms and how they're constantly changing and being refined in ways that can work against folks that have been in industries like Uber and Lyft for a long time.
And what's really sad is that these careers or these jobs or whatever have huge chasms to where there's no way to move up between that. It's like you have the peasants and then you have the executives, and there seems to be a giant gap in between. That's part of why I decided to be as independent as I could be from the workforce. So the last juiciest bit is politics. So how has politics, and I think we all know a little bit, but how in your book, how has politics been influenced by these new media technologies?
Yeah. So in this book, since again it's aimed at really educating undergrads or a lay audience about here's some of the basics of how these things work, it really talks about the ins and outs of how individuals can use technology or how technology might increase political participation. But the book I'm working on right now is much more depressing, I suppose.
Sounds right up my alley. Yeah, great.
It uses extensive longitudinal data to look at. I look at about a 15, 20-year window, and I look at groups on the left and the right. And I talk about how digital technologies have created this synergy, which on the one hand is nice because it lets different kinds of actors effectively connect and communicate and collaborate in ways that were unthinkable in the past. But how this synergy, at least in the US, has become quite dysfunctional and has really become quite bad for political participation in democracy. And just to give you kind of the general sense, what I can talk about in the book is how political parties, interest groups, think tanks, and partisan media outlets are working together to craft these narratives about political opponents and cast them as threats to their way of life, and sometimes, even their existence. And because we don't have these real world or robust community spaces where we're in contact with our neighbors, sometimes who have very different political dispositions or different religions from us, it makes it incredibly easy to dehumanize our political opponents. And this isn't great for democracy. If you think about, one of the things we want to do is have discussion of issues and try to come to kinds of consensus. But it's great for all those other groups, right? It's great for political parties and interest groups and think tanks, because they can sell us everything from, and I wish I was kidding, not just candidates, but also meals ready to eat using this partisan language. And it's not great for participation, because what happens to the rest of us? So first there's this middle that gets kind of lost, like this middle that's like, hey, how do we get ourselves out of this? But it also, so that we're not sure what our next step is, but then it also really makes us, or worth as democratic agents, is to contribute money to these different groups, or of course become billboards for ideas. And that's one of the things I thought was so interesting about sort of like what Trump does, is how his ardent supporters are basically the billboard for all his ideas, but we're not actively engaged with our communities or shaping agendas. Our value is money, billboard, and of course, every 2 years to help get out the vote. So our democratic imagination, unfortunately, is shrinking, and we don't really think about the country we want to be. We're more interested in our enemies and how, maybe if we give $5 a month, the group or that politician will fight against our enemy on our behalf.
So, and I used to travel across America, and I noticed that there was an information desert between California and New York. If you kind of drive through, and any local hotel, breakfast place, you would see Fox News just blaring full blast, as if that's just. And I have to agree with you in saying it really feels like there's a disconnect between. Those people would rather get their information from these media outlets rather than talk to their neighbors. Do you think this is why Europe is so able to hang on to democracy so well? Because, I mean, the European system works well. And I live here now. Do you think this disconnect between the neighbors is like really detrimental?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, it is, because if you don't come in contact with, so the Fox News avid watcher, then you don't know where they're at. And honestly, before you know that they're a Fox News watcher, you're going to learn a lot of other things about them. People avoid politics in non-political situations. Social scientists have found out again and again, we go to great lengths to not reveal a lot of politics. I mean, some folks, of course, they're really super into it. It's central to their identity, but most of us are not doing that. And so by the time you find out someone's political position, you already know so much, it's going to be hard to dehumanize them in the way that it's so easy to do in some of these forums and on, in the headlines or in casual conversations with a friend that shares your political point of view. So yes, I do think that matters. I think there's a lot of pieces, right? The political system matters. The fact that we're a two-party system in the US isn't particularly helpful either. There's no reason to find consensus. In fact, as I've seen even recently with the debt ceiling fiasco, it's frowned upon and can have consequences for future abilities to try to get anything done, in this case in the House of Representatives. So yeah, there are a lot of ways in which I think, if not only, we got to know each other better, we started reconnecting in more meaningful ways that weren't political initially, and, pushed back on some of this rhetoric, we would be much better off.
Yeah. I'm hoping I can deprogram a few friends and family that maybe don the red hats, you know, these red fascist caps. But we'll just have to wait and see what happens with that. But another thing I wanted to touch on right before we go is you also wrote a book, Abortion, Politics, Mass Media, and Social Movements in America. Can you briefly tell me what that's about and how that's, relevant to what we're going through now?
Yeah, no, so that book looked at 4 organizations, 2 that were opposed to abortion and 2 that were for legal abortion, and looked at their strategies and tactics and how they used media to try to further their ends. And I tried to be sort of forward thinking about where things were heading. And at the time, now this book is 2015, that was at a time when Planned Parenthood was under attack, but there was also a reproductive justice movement that was on the rise. And now what we've seen, of course, are things have changed dramatically in the wake of Dobbs, where we have many states now that have made abortion illegal, or in some states in Florida, very inaccessible, with a 6-week ban. So we're in this interesting political moment. And for progressives or folks that support legal abortion, which we're increasingly finding out is a much larger portion of the U.S. population that's willing to actually seems to be willing to vote more single issue, which was something that anti-abortion folks have been doing for a long time. But so now we see that there is this rallying cry for more accessible abortion. So that changes the Democratic side of the equation, who has been supportive of abortion, but has been reluctant to get too much into the politics, as they're still not articulating a clear vision, but neither are, abortion advocate groups either. They're saying, yes, we need to get people elected. But I think, to be a successful movement, you need to have a clear vision of what you're headed for. So I think that in the short term, we'll see that works, but in the longer term, it's going to be harder. And then on the Republican side of the equation, we see Republican politicians are struggling because, if you're a Republican, want to be presidential candidate, and you're trying to appease those primary voters, they want a complete ban, but that's not going to play well, of course, in the general election. So they're trying to figure out how, unless you're, I kind of put them in, you're either in moral absolutist, right? So I kind of think of Mike Pence, who's was opposed to abortion before and is going to continue to have a hardline approach to abortion, but they have a lot of folks that are just, a lot of Republican candidates who are, they're political strategists, right? They're trying to game the system so that they can have the right position on abortion at the right time. What's been really interesting, because I include abortion politics in this new book as well, is seeing how some of the anti-abortion groups have positioned themselves right before the Dobbs decision, but then in the wake of Dobbs, and how winning can be very bad for a group because when you win, people move on to other issues, and so groups have had to grapple with the problem of success. And one of the interesting things that a message has kind of coalesced around is this notion of saving the children. And this means, so abortion and saving, it's always been about saving babies. So save the unborn babies, but now there's a larger rallying cry to save the children from everything from the threat of drag shows and indoctrination in schools, which they're calling grooming. And so the choice of language is very fascinating because it certainly resonates with the QAnon part of the Republican right, of the far right, where they're using a lot of similar language, but repackaging it slightly, and then having this whole save the children theme to try to keep people engaged in, abortion politics, and by extension, some of these other educational, causes and higher education causes as well.
But we can have them shot in school. That's fine, just no drag shows.
No drag shows, please.
Well, we'll have you back when your new awesome depressing book comes out. Come on, depress the hell out of me, and we'll do this again. You are just a hoot, and I loved having you on. I want to thank Deana Rohlinger, Professor of Sociology, Florida State,